We had to ask for extra security at the neonatal ward because, and we had to explain that as nutty as it sounded, this strange man had made these threats. We didn't really know who he was or what his background was, but we were frightened. And the worst thing, obviously, as we all know, is that it left Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell completely unchecked to carry on with the abuse.
Keir Starmer says Peter Mandelson repeatedly lied to his team about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and that he regrets appointing him as ambassador to the US in 2024. It comes as the recently released files appear to show that Mandelson also lobbied the Obama administration to water down banking restrictions after a request from Epstein. As more and more comes out about those connected to the former financier and convicted paedophile, let's speak to Vicky Ward, an investigative journalist who spent decades reporting on Jeffrey Epstein. Vicky wrote a profile of him for Vanity Fair back in 2003. It was due to include allegations of abuse from Maria and Annie Farmer, who filed the earliest known complaints against him. But those allegations were later redacted. Vicky joins us now. Very good afternoon, Vicky. Thank you for your time. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what happened with that piece?
Yeah, of course. And thank you for having me. What happened with that piece, is fairly straightforward, actually. Maria and Annie Farmer told me what had happened to them at the hands of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. I spoke, and they went on the record. So did their mother. So did a well-known artist, Eric Fischel. And so did a fairly well-known businessman at the time. And I think even by today's standards, that is to have three first-hand witnesses who were told contemporaneously by the Farmer sisters what had happened to them, should meet editorial standards. Jeffrey Epstein, obviously, and Ghislaine Maxwell went berserk, and there's documentation actually of this that are in the latest Epstein files that have been released. You see Jeffrey Epstein writing to my boss, Graydon Carter, to complain about me, and you see there's also a fax that I found last night that he sent to me telling me what a dreadful journalist I was. And he also, but behind my back, went to see Graydon Carter in the offices of Vanity Fair, after which the Farmer sisters and their allegations were cut from the article that was published in February, it was in the March 2003 edition of the magazine.
How did all of that leave you feeling?
Well, I was frankly in floods of tears. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was furious for myself. I was very, very worried and frightened for the Farmer sisters, because I had effectively exposed them now to Ghislaine Maxwell and to Jeffrey Epstein. I had exposed the fact that they had told the magazine what had happened. And because we hadn't gone to press, we hadn't given them any sort of protection. And Maria Farmer's life went on to be miserable because, she has said that Ghislaine Maxwell went on to threaten her. It also personally, it was a great cost to me, the stress and the anxiety of this. I already had a very complicated pregnancy, and I went into labor much too soon with my twins, and at 30 weeks. So I produced minuscule babies weighing 2 pounds and just under 3 pounds each. They both had health issues and had to be in the hospital for 2 months. And Jeffrey Epstein had threatened them when I was pregnant. And we had to ask for extra security at the neonatal ward because, and we had to explain that as nutty as it sounded, this strange man had made these threats. We didn't really know who he was or what his background was, but we were frightened. And the worst thing, obviously, as we all know, is that it left Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell completely unchecked to carry on with the abuse, and it meant that hundreds more children got abused because I did get a call from the FBI, but not until well over a year later. And then the FBI investigation took a long time until eventually, as we know, Epstein ended up with that ridiculous cushy plea deal in 2008. But a lot of the crime and harm could have been avoided if we had put the Farmer Sisters into that published article.
How are the Farmer Sisters now?
Well, I think, Annie Farmer, who testified at Ghislaine Maxwell's criminal trial, has been front and centre in lobbying Congress. I think she's been front and centre when the survivors have gone to Capitol Hill. She's been very high profile on the media, pushing for Congress to do the right thing over this. And I think she's been front and centre saying that what's happened is not remotely good enough and has been deeply re-traumatizing and triggering for herself and for other victims.
Yeah.
And she herself is a therapist. I mean, she has considerable expertise in all of this, aside from her own personal history.
You've watched this unravel over 20 years, Vicky, but it just hasn't unravelled enough. And the huge scandal, along with the fall of people like Peter Mandelson, is that only one person is in jail for the exploitation or abuse or sexual assault of minors. I mean, that is a fact, isn't it? And it is a really, really shocking fact.
Yeah, it's an appalling fact. And I think the problem in part has to do with the way that the American justice system works. I think it's funny. It's not without good reason that the two figures that in a way have paid the biggest price are British, actually, because in America, what tends to happen is the government, in order to pursue big criminals, does deals with little ones. And I think that, Ghislaine Maxwell does talk in her habeas corpus petition as part of her appeal about 25 men who did private civil settlements with survivors because they knew that there was a fear of criminal prosecutions. And this is something that I'd heard all along, that there were these settlements done in the dark between survivors and other men in Jeffrey Epstein's circle. And I think it's quite clear we know who they are from. We know the names. They're all over these releases from the DOJ. But this is how the government work. They flip people. They flip the small fish in order to get to the big fish. And I think that is exactly what happened in this case.
Yeah.
It's not irrelevant, by the way, that back in the early 1990s, in fact, Jeffrey Epstein flipped for the government in order to put his then boss, Steve Hoffenberg, who was convicted of the biggest Ponzi scheme in American history prior to Bernie Madoff. Jeffrey Epstein worked with Hoffenberg, and Jeffrey Epstein testified to the government, which meant that Jeffrey Epstein never went to jail for these were financial crimes that he was part of. So this unfortunately is how the system works.
Yeah. And Jeffrey Epstein himself had offered a kind of, would we call it a plea bargain for the sentence that he was serving when he died. But there were many, many other convictions that he did the deal on, weren't there?
Right. That's exactly right. And, again, he was very, very clever. We do see that. These documents are enlightening, actually, in regard to how that plea deal went down. I mean, you can see that the lawyers that he had on his team were people who would go on to work with Alex Acosta, the U.S. attorney in Miami at the time. Alex Acosta, it was in his personal interest to work with them because he then went into private practice with one of them, Jay Lefkowitz. And you can see there's an email in which the names are redacted. Of course they are, protecting the government officials, the Justice Department officials, in which they go back and forward when in 2011 they're being queried about this plea deal by Brad Edwards, the lawyer who went on to represent many of Epstein's victims,
Yeah.
saying, pushing them on how they could have done this deal behind the victims' backs, which turned out to be illegal. And you see in the email these unnamed officials digging in, saying, look, we know it wasn't a good deal, but that's not the point. We have to stick to our guns and say we didn't legally have to tell the victims. They knew it wasn't a good deal. They knew that it was absurd and cushy. One kind of justice for rich people and a completely different kind of justice for poor people.
Sure. So we have all of those legal deals there, Vicky, but there's also what seems to be the unwritten deal of Boys Club, which is that you just don't talk about Boys Club. And I think it's very interesting that Melissa French Gates was asked, Bill Gates' ex-wife, on a podcast in the last couple of days for some kind of comment about this. And she said, all of this talk brings up a very, very painful series of memories for me about my marriage. But you have to go and ask him. You have to go and ask the man these questions. And it is women who are talking about this and trying to tell their stories. And it is not the men. Do you think that there will be a man who will break ranks and actually confirm what happened, what they saw, when they saw it, who was there? Will that ever happen, do you think?
I wish. I really doubt it. I mean, I think the level of misogyny that has emerged from a much wider swathe of men than even I realised. Brad Karp, guy I know, respected lawyer, head of an enormous law firm in the US, Paul Weiss. There's an email from Epstein to him saying, can I help you, protect your client, Robert Kraft, the owner of the Patriots football team. When Robert Kraft was caught soliciting prostitution at a Chinese massage parlor in Palm Beach, and Kraft replying, and Brad Karp replies back, he's going to need the best. He came out and apologized yesterday because until these documents came out, nobody knew that he had been corresponding and obviously knew Epstein well. The disgusting emails between Steve Tisch, who I also know, the owner of the Giants football team, and Epstein, saying, well, if you're going to, is this woman a pro or a civilian? I mean, come on. And the answer is no, they've been caught. They've been caught, and they're sheepish and they're ashamed. Are they going to change their ways? I doubt it. And I think the whole thing is sickening proof for women of how all these men, men in this social and wealth milieu, this elite plane, think of women as just objects. It's disgusting.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us this afternoon. So much to think about there, and I think you're absolutely right, Vicky. That is Vicky Ward, investigative journalist who has spent decades, as you heard, reporting on Jeffrey Epstein. And, the way that the women are talked about just as commodities, I think there is something in seeing those personal emails, Jane, that really brings home to everybody, and the pictures that are emerging that bring home to everybody how irrelevant those women's lives were to the men who became involved with them, paid for them, and then, just dispensed with them.
I think they barely thought of them as human. Thought of them as barely human. Wouldn't it be great if one of them did, at least one, came out and said something?
Yeah, and said,
look, I'm really sorry.
I've now realised, that I was part of something that, that I maybe knew deep down at the time was wrong, but I went along with it because X, Y, and Z were there. Mm. They all said, no, this is fine. We've all been prey to that kind of pressure. Well, not that kind of pressure, but we've all been prey to a kind of pressure in our lives, and we understand that. And I think you're right. For one man to, turn tail and head towards decency wouldn't be a bad thing.
Yeah, lots of men like to tell us they're brave. Well, show us how brave you are.